in thy tender care, and take us to heaven to live with thee there.
Good job. Good job. All right, have a fun day at Sunday school.
The bigger kids are going to come and join us.
All right. All right, I knew we would have a small group for church today with that weather. That keeps a lot of people from being able to get out. But I thought maybe there'd be a lot fewer for Sunday school, and I'm really glad to see y'all here. Yeah, this is wonderful. And this was I don't know, I just had a lot of fun going through this. In fact, there's when I like am doing my studies and preparing for either preaching or teaching a class, there's a lot of different sites that I look at where there's certain people that I'm checking to see what they've said about it and different sermons and stuff, and several of the big ones that I look at, they've never preached a sermon on this. They preach on everything else in the Bible. And I found a whole bunch of sermons that were really wacko there. I'll tell you when we get to it. So I just had a lot of fun going through this. I think if we can make it, we'll get about halfway through the chapter today, and then halfway through the other half next week. And that gives us 1 week extra, because I had us going till December 10th for the book of Acts. So we might have, well, maybe I won't get it, so we'll see. If I do finish it, though, then we'll have an extra week, so you can think about what you'd like to do on that 1 week. So let's turn to Acts 28. And you remember last week we went through like the whole story of their shipwreck and the storm. Yeah, so obviously Luke is here with him, and Luke remembers all this stuff really well, because there's a lot of details about these events. But it's all part of, keep this always in mind, it's part of God's fulfilling of his promise to Paul, that Paul was going to bear witness to him in Rome. So everything the devil throws at him, a riot in Jerusalem, imprisonment in Caesarea, a shipwreck in the Mediterranean, and what you're going to see here today, none of that stuff can stop God's plan from coming to pass. Okay, let's start with verse 1. I'm just going to start with the first 6 verses. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. All right, remember last week their ship had wrecked. They had made it all the way here, and then they were driven by the northeaster, and then their ship wrecked on the eastern edge of this island. There's a very nice harbor actually on the north side of the island, but when you're being driven by a shipwreck, you don't get to choose where you go. So they hit there and they wrecked. But as the Lord had promised Paul, remember, was it 270? Who remembers? 276. 276. All 276 people were saved. They all made it to shore somehow. But remember, this is a northeaster. There was a storm. And what time of the year was it? October. And so to swim ashore in the cold water in October with a heavy wind, probably rains, that would be kind of not too fun, right? But the natives are there and see them come ashore and get fires going for them. So that's really great. Malta, this small island here, today, it's an independent country, about 500,000 people live there. Malta's got a very interesting history. It had, by this point in time of our text, it was under Roman rule, but it had originally been populated by Phoenicians. So look at verse 2 when it says the native people. And there's a footnote there. Who's my footnote checker? What does it say?
Greek barbario?
Yeah, the Barbaroi. The Barbaroi are the barbarians. So I've told you before, the Jews divided the whole world into two groups of people. There were the Jews and there were the Gentiles. That was everybody else. Well, the Greek world divided the whole world into two groups of people too. There were the Greeks and there were the barbarians. So if you didn't speak Greek, then you were a barbarian. So these people spoke a dialect of Phoenician, so they're barbarians. But they show unusual kindness and they get a fire going. But all right, now we get to something very interesting here in verse 3. Paul doesn't sit and just be served, right? He jumps up to hell. And so he's collecting sticks and he puts them on the fire, and obviously somewhere in that bundle of sticks there was a little viper. And when it gets near the warmth of the fire, it jumps out and grabs him by the hand, and it fastens to his hand. And verse 4, when the barbarians saw that creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "Oh, no doubt this man is a murderer." So even though he escaped from the shipwreck, justice, and you see there justice is capitalized in your ESV. As you know, that's an interpretive. The interpreter chose to capitalize it because in Greco-Roman mythology there was a goddess, a daughter of Zeus, whose name was Justice. And her name, her job among the gods was to go and make justice happen. So if somebody did something and didn't get punished for it, she was supposed to make sure they got punished. So they're assuming here that if they're not talking about justice in general, but more likely I think they're right that they're talking about probably this goddess Justice. They're thinking this is her work to have him get bit by this viper so that he's going to.
How is Luke getting the interpretation of this? Since they're not Greek speaking, like did the barbarians have some sort of an interpreter with them, or?
That's a good question. I would guess probably some of each. There's probably people in the group that understood their dialect, and there were probably people on the island that did understand Greek, even if that wasn't their first
Luke was Greek.
language.
Was he not? Was not Luke Greek?
Yeah, Luke was Greek.
So he would have understood what.
Well, he wouldn't have probably. He might have known Phoenician. Maybe it's possible.
Oh, Phoenician.
Yeah, mine says they were non-Greek speaking people.
Right.
Here's the very interesting thing about all of this. Some people have pointed out that, they've tried to say that this story is invented or made up because they pointed out that in Malta there are no poisonous snakes. Now, does this seem like a story that was made up?
No.
The details are too good. There's way too many possible explanations. So what would be one? There used to be poisonous snakes. But Malta's very heavily populated, and 500,000 people on a little dinky island like that, the poisonous snakes may have eventually died out. That's possible. There are 4 kinds of snakes on the island, and although you'll typically read that none of them are poisonous. One of them actually is poisonous. This was interesting. I spent way too much time reading it. But if it bites a human, it bites with its front fangs, which are not poisonous. But if it bites like a mouse or something it's going to eat, it actually has back fangs that are poisonous. So they actually do have a poisonous snake. So if it latches on and hangs on, it is possible. So it could be one of those. Or it could have been a poisonous snake that was carried ashore in the shipwreck. Somehow was hiding in the wreckage, or there's all kinds of reasons, right? You don't automatically assume that he made the story up just because things are different now than they were 2,000 years ago. One thing, though, that I think we do have to say, there are some interpreters that say, well, it wasn't a poisonous snake that bit him. So the native people just assumed that he would die from the poison, but it was actually a plain old ordinary snake. That, I think, is not an acceptable interpretation. Those people assumed that he's going to die from this snake bite, so they must clearly recognize this snake. They obviously know that people who get bit by certain kinds of snakes die. That's part of this story. So this had to be a poisonous snake. Let's look up another passage that I find very interesting. Who was asking me? I think my son-in-law was asking me about this just the other day. Let's go to Mark 16. Mark 16. Okay, and in Mark 16, the Gospel of Mark, look at the end of verse 8. And at the end of verse 8, you see the little note there that says some of the earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. All right, now this, when I was in college, textual criticism threw me for a loop. I just thought, well, it's got to be real clear what God gave us and what He didn't. And now I'm much more comfortable, accepting that we have different manuscripts and we have sufficient evidence for the things that are God's Word that we don't have to be worried about this. But the big issue then is that these last verses from verse 9 to verse 20, they appear in some of the really old Greek manuscripts, but the best ones, the most reliable ones, don't have it. The Gospel of Mark ends for them at verse 8. So, for example, when the King James Version was translated in the 1600s, they didn't have those really good manuscripts. So this was included as part of Mark. And then they found these manuscripts which don't have it. And so most Bibles, English Bibles today, will have some kind of note like this, just to let you know. What should we do with that? Well, I think this is what you do with a piece of text in the Bible that we're not certain about. It's been customarily used by the church. It's been appropriated by the church. I think it's okay for us to use it, but we shouldn't form any doctrine based solely on something that's in one of those passages. Does that make sense? In other words, let's not make any doctrine based on something that we're not sure about. But we can only make doctrine on things we are sure about, and there's sufficient evidence for everything else that we don't have to worry about. So, for example, in Mark 16, go to verse 16. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Well, guess where that verse appears? Well, you'll see it this Wednesday, in Wednesday night Bible study. It's in Martin Luther's Small Catechism. That's one of the verses he uses for the things he says about baptism in the small catechism. So can we use that verse to refer to baptism? Yes. Why? Because there's lots of other verses about baptism, so that we know that this is true. But go down to verse 17 now. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents with their hands. And if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. So there it has Jesus telling us signs we should expect to see among his followers. And so that some of his followers would cast out demons. Did that happen? Yeah, we've already seen that in the book of Acts. Some of his followers would speak in new tongues. Did that happen? Yeah, we've seen that in the book of Acts. Some of his followers will pick up serpents with their hands. Have we seen that? Yes, just today in this story of Paul. So this is the only story in the Bible where someone actually picks up a serpent and it doesn't bite them. So I think my son-in-law was asking about these Christian fundamentalist groups in like Appalachia and stuff like that. So you've heard about that, like the snake handlers. So they read this verse and they say these are the signs that will accompany those who believe. So they'll go out and capture some rattlesnakes and they'll have a church service and they'll walk around and they'll pick up the snakes. Have you seen this? I heard it. Some of you have never seen this before. Oh, this is yeah, you could probably Google it, I would guess. They've been doing this since the 1800s.
But then the Bible talks about not tempting God.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there you go.
It's purposely tempt, you know. It's purposely-
Yeah, so I'm not gonna propose this to the elders. Here's the interesting thing. I mean, someone who studied this has documented that there are over 100 people in these groups who, during the snake handling, they got bit and they died. About over 100. So they also say that snakes, and when I was a kid, I used to catch snakes. Now I'm kind of spooked by them. But when I was a kid, I didn't care, and I'd catch those garter snakes. And did you ever do that?
Yeah.
When you first catch a garter snake, it's writhing around like crazy. It's trying to, if you don't get it right, by the head, it's going to whip its head around and bite you.
Oh, yeah.
But after you catch the garden snake and you hold it for 10 minutes, they get really docile. They just kind of slither from one hand to the other, I'm freaking Dawn out here. But you can hold them. They stick their tongue out. I used to let them stick their tongue out on my cheek and so I'm sure it's the same with rattlesnakes too. I'm sure, right? They get passive after a while, so you can probably handle them, but it's not a safe thing to do. And is it based on this text? Is it something that we should do as part of our church ceremonies? No. I feel like a consensus is no.
Jim, what do you think?
All right.
The thought just came to me. Are these passages, these verses right here, used by the people who refuse medical treatment?
I don't know.
Who say God will heal me, I don't need medicine?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that would be something, right? To drink poison and then say, don't send the ambulance.
Well, I mean, there's people that won't go to the hospital.
Yeah.
And they're taking, you hear that once in a while, and government comes in and takes the kids away from the parents because they refuse to get medical treatment and stuff. And I just wondered if they take this to heart.
Because they will lay hands on the sick and they will recover. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some non-Christian groups, like heretical groups too, that are like this, not just Christians, but the point is these give legitimate expression to things that we might expect to see, but should not be the basis for centering some kind of doctrine in it. So, in all likelihood, one of two things must have been true. Either Luke knew about these verses in Mark, and so he told the story of Paul to kind of highlight that Paul is one of the people who's following in the footsteps of Jesus, and this is happening to him. Or whoever wrote that add-on to the end of Luke knew about Paul and wrote that in the back of Mark to try to call attention to the fact that Jesus predicted this would happen. It's got to be one or the other. But it can't be a coincidence that we have this story here about Paul getting bit and nothing happens to him. We definitely will not finish. So the people they're assuming that he's got to be a murderer, and so justice is killing him. That's why he got bit by this snake. What's wrong with that? It's the same problem that Job's friends had in the book of Job, right? When you see someone and something bad happens to them, we should never assume that something bad is happening to them because God wants to punish them or because they've done something bad. Never assume that. That's not how God's justice works in this world. So they're waiting for him to swell up. It says, the poison's going to take its effect and fall on it. But he just shook it off in the fire and nothing's happening. And they wait a long time and nothing happens. So then at the end of verse 6, they changed their minds and they said that he was a god. Now, I was going to have us look it up, but I'm just going to skip it for now. Do you remember back in Acts chapter 12 when King Herod, this would have been Herod Antipas, gave a speech, and he gave such a great speech, and he had on all his sparkling robes, and all the people started to praise him and say, "Oh, it is not the voice of man; it is the voice of a God." What happened to Herod? Remember?
He died.
Yeah.
The Lord struck him down.
Yeah, the Lord struck him. I think with he got like parasites or something, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he got like a worm, says, that ate him up. In other words, God punished him for accepting praise that he was a God when he's not a God. God takes seriously the first commandment, right? And then there was an occasion, I can't remember, was it at Lystra or Derbe? In the first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas do a miracle, and they start saying that Paul and Barnabas were Zeus and Hermes. In Greek mythology, Zeus, the head god, would go with Hermes, who was kind of like his mouthpiece, and they would walk upon the earth and visit people. And Hermes was the one who would do most of the talking. So the people there claimed that Barnabas was Zeus and Paul, because he does most of the talking, that he was Hermes. And they go to sacrifice an animal to them. And when Paul and Barnabas figured out what they were doing, do you remember what they said? "Don't do this, don't, we're just men just like you." In other words, unlike Herod, they refused to accept praise of being a god. Because that is a fundamental idolatry. You should never do that. Well, here in this case, the people changed their minds and they said that he was a god. We don't see here Paul rebuking them, but it may have been something they did away from him. Maybe it wasn't right in front of him that they did it. But it does play a part in the story, because in their minds now, he's someone really, really great. And that leads into the next part of the story and what happened. Back in Acts 28, verse 7. "Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days." So the people, because they saw what happened to Paul, are speaking very positively of him. And so now he gets welcomed into the house of kind of the head guy on the island, and they stay overnight with them for 3 days and having a nice time there. At verse 8, it happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. So, remember the Mark passage? Those who follow Jesus, these signs would accompany them. They would lay their hands on people, and they would heal them. So Paul, in addition to being bit by the serpent and not dying, he's laying his hands on, and he's healing this man. He's got what the interpreters think is what's called Malta fever, which was caused by a microbe in the goat's milk. And he has dysentery. This is the only place in the whole Bible where dysentery is mentioned. You want to know what the Greek word for dysentery is? Dysentery. Obviously, our English word came from the Greek word, right? But Paul heals him and shows once again that God is at work through Paul. In verse 9, and when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. So God is using Paul very mightily, isn't he, to bring healing to the people. And almost certainly he's not just healing people, but what else would you expect that he's doing? Preaching the gospel to them. So we, once again, our 4 missionary journeys, right? We're seeing the gospel spread from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world. See it spreading. Verse 10, they also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. All right, how much time do I have? Let's go a little further, is that okay?
Yeah.
Verse 11, after 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria, with the twin gods as a figurehead. All right, so they crashed in October, and so now this is 3 months is November, December, and January, and the ancient Roman historian Pliny says that it was in early February that the winds would tend to shift. So instead of coming this way, they would start to come this way. So for us, February is still winter, but for them, because of the way the winds are going, now it becomes possible again to sail on the sea. So they get a ship. It's a ship out of Alexandria. Well, you remember that their ship that crashed was also out of Alexandria. But what did we say about that? Alexandria in Egypt, that's where the Greco-Roman world got its grain. That's where they grew all the wheat. And so they had these giant grain ships out of Alexandria that took the grain to the world. So Paul was originally in one of these Alexandrian ships when he crashed. We find that there's another Alexandrian ship that made it into the port. And that's the one that they're able to get on now. And it has the twin gods as a figurehead. So the twin gods in Greek mythology are Castor and Pollux. They were twins. They were sons of Zeus, and among other things, they were the gods of favorable seas. So you could see why sailors would have liked to honor those as their gods. And it's believed that the ships were named by whatever was on the figurehead. So on this ship, the figurehead is the twin gods. So this ship's name was probably the twin gods. You know what? It's a good reminder, though, of the difficult world that Jews and Christians had to live in back in the 1st century. Everything was named after a god. If you went to the public, you didn't have your own bath in your house back then. There were public baths. But the public baths might be named after Aphrodite, the Aphrodite Memorial Baths. And you go to the store and it might be the Zeus Marketplace, or everything circled around their idolatry. So how do you live as a Christian when everything around you is grounded in idolatry? it's the same problem we have today, isn't it? Where can you go? What job can you get where you don't have now diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of your corporate policy? Where can you go today where you don't have the idolatries of today's time being thrown in your face all the time? So we're in the same situation they were in the first century. How do you live in a world like this? And I'm going off track just a little bit, but if you look through the book of 1 Corinthians, you see that there were some rules that the Jews had for how to live in this world. They said, don't eat meat offered to idols. So as a Jew, of course, you would never go into a Greek temple and offer a sacrifice. But the Greeks who would offer sacrifices, then the temple would sell that meat. That's how they would survive. So you didn't have a butcher store, you went to the temple. That's where you bought your steaks. And the Jews said, no, don't buy those steaks. You can't eat that. Paul says it's okay to eat those steaks. In other words, they were offered to an idol, but the idol's not real. And it's not, you're not doing something wrong if you eat that meat. But he did say, don't eat the meat if, does anyone remember?
If it causes offense.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you have a brother or sister in Christ who maybe they were Jewish and they were taught all their lives, don't eat that meat. And now you go to sit down to eat and he looks at your steak and he says, that's from the temple of Zeus, don't eat that. What should you do?
Don't eat it.
So you don't offend them. In other words, even things that don't cause a problem in the sight of God, if they're going to cause offense or trouble your neighbor, then your fellow brother or sister in Christ, then don't do it. So Paul, it has a different angle, a different look on how we should survive in this world that we're in today. We could spend a lot of time talking about that. I think it's very interesting stuff. All right, verse 12. How much time do I have now? Okay, let's remember I left off at verse 12 and we'll pick up from there. I hope we'll see you again next Sunday. Something very interesting in this next section too that I want to call your attention to.
What did you say?
You'll find it interesting. Thank you all for being here. God bless.
And based on Mark.